Hello, you lovely people. How are you all doing today? For today's video, I'm very excited to share something that I personally really enjoy doing. So, have you ever wondered what goes into creating a fantasy setting? Are you perhaps working on one of your own? Aurelia is the setting of my story Dawnkeeper and all the other connected storylines I've come up with over the past 15 years. It's something that began as just a personal project for fun, that's kind of grown into a beast of its own. And I'm really looking forward to sharing my process with you and how I went about creating this. And if you have your own setting you're working on, maybe it'll be helpful to you. So where does designing your own setting begin? Does it start as a fully wide open world or just a small seed that grows into something bigger? In the early days of Dawnkeeper, Aurelia as a setting was just a single city in the middle of a wasteland. The outside world was dead and corrupted after the actions of a sorceress who tried to seize power. The entire storyline took place in this one city until one day when I was sitting on a train on my way to a workshop. To pass the time, I pulled out my phone, opened up Google Docs, and started doing some work on my world building. I was looking out the window of the train as I passed over a river, and I took notice of all the graffiti that had built up over the years, of the different trees I passed, of the fields with cows and horses, of the different building styles, and I started getting some cool ideas that didn't really fit in with what I'd already planned. And that's when a new idea came to me. I decided to just let go of all the limitations I'd already put on the world building, such as restricting it to that one city in the middle of a wasteland, and I started to write down all the ideas I wanted to include, no matter how ridiculous or unrealistic they were. Suddenly, it began to grow into something much bigger than just a city. I let my imagination go wild with it, and over time, I came up with more and more ideas until it became a fully expanded world with its own religions, races, cities, and politics. World building can seem like an intimidating prospect. Creating an entire setting out of just your imagination isn't something you do in one go. You treat it like a seed that grows into a plant. To begin with, what is your central theme? What is the place? What is the hook? And what is the idea you want to build your world around? What genre and time period do you want to make it? You can also consider merging genres like space fantasy or magitech. Basically, starting with something small and expanding from there makes the process much less overwhelming. So where are you going to get your inspiration from? Regardless of what anyone says, you're not just going to come up with an entire world setting that wasn't affected or inspired by anything else. While I would definitely class my own setting as fantasy, regardless of what genre you're creating for, there are so many interesting real-world sources of ideas. For Aurelia, the mythology of the ancient Celtic and Druidic societies was what I drew on mostly. The story of Balor and the Fomorians was the basis for the ancient history of my setting, except I gave them a bit of an astral twist. I also worked in ideas from other cultures, such as Yggdrasil being the basis of the god tree in the city of Mithan. The typical real-world inspirations we see in media are going to be European, Middle Eastern, and Asian, specifically Chinese and Japanese, but there are a lot of lesser known and represented cultures that have their own fascinating mythology and folktales. For example, here in Australia, Indigenous Australians have the creation story of the rainbow serpent. Do you have any ideas for interesting inspirations that aren't commonly seen? Share it in the comments if you do. Next, let's talk about races. There is an apex predator that begins their life as eggs in the water until they surface and eventually grow wings. With its importance to their reproductive cycle, water will forever be an important aspect of their culture. As they reach advanced age, their wings begin to atrophy. They grow branch-like growths on their body until their bodies become so overgrown that they root into the ground and go into a hibernation that they never wake from. This is the Fae of Aurelia, and their inspiration was dragonflies. Bet you didn't think I was going to say that. Continuing on with the real-world inspirations idea, there's a lot of existing life forms that can be a great basis for coming up with your own races. My first iteration of the Fae were basically gothic elves, which was pretty lame. I was encouraged to go weird with them, and I came up with multiple different designs. Ultimately, I decided to base them on trees and dragonflies. A common theme I see in media when it comes to fantasy races is that there's a single trait that the entire race is built around. For example, in the Belgoride series by David Eddings, as much as I loved that series growing up, the races that appear in it are very, well, let's say, one-dimensional. You have a race whose defining trait is that they are all highly practical, another where everyone are basically spies, another where everyone is fantastic at horse riding, one where they're basically Vikings, another where they're all evil. I see that sort of thing a lot in world building, or they're basically just a real world culture like Japanese with a different name. Try something a little different and look at animals and insects. Animals or insects have their own unique societies and behaviors that could be really interesting for fantasy races. And then there's the visuals of plants and animals can be inspiring. Bright colors to warn of danger, thorns to protect oneself. One thing I've really been wanting to make a race out of is the orchid mantis. And if you don't know what that is, go and Google it. Unless you're afraid of bugs, then maybe don't. Looking for ideas in unexpected places is honestly much better than just reusing the same typical tired tropes that we see over and over. But what about the dark, the scary? How can you create something terrifying in your setting? It's unlikely that everything will be bright and happy in your setting, so how can you create something terrifying? Much of Aurelia's life forms are based on insects, and like the Fae, many of them transition into tree-like life forms as they reach the end of their life. But then there are the Fomorians. In Celtic mythology, the Fomorians were said to have come from the sea, but like I said earlier, in my setting, they're astral creatures. Their designs are based on sea creatures, and that is because marine creatures are often more alien than actual aliens we see in most media. They invoke a primal fear in humans, along with the deep water. Once again, I'm using real-world concepts and creatures to create something fantastical. Now, when it comes to creating something frightening, I would say embrace the unknown. I'm definitely not an expert when it comes to horror, but the fear of what we don't know is at the heart of something being terrifying. Think about what might scare you and why it scares you. What would make a dark forest intimidating as you hear howls and strange sounds in the distance? It's likely because you don't know what's there among the trees and what is going to happen to you. What would make traveling among an alien civilization worrying? You can't communicate with them, you don't know their culture, you don't know what they're going to do. Why do you think thalassophobia, the fear of deep, vast bodies of ocean, is such a common phobia? You just don't know what's down there. Anyway, now that we have a world and the beings to inhabit it, what about where they actually live? Have you thought about the different biomes that will be present in your world? Will you have temperate forests and tropical jungles? Will you have snow-capped mountains or vast sweltering deserts? Or maybe even all of them? While your setting doesn't have to follow real-world rules, you should probably think about how these biomes would interact with each other. As in, don't do like I used to do and have the hot, sandy desert in the south where it's meant to be cold. Unless, of course, you want to give a world-building reason why this is. If you ever played World of Warcraft, specifically Wrath of the Lich King, the entirety of the continent of Northrend is cold and snowy, except for the zone of Sholazar Basin, which is a hot and tropical dense jungle. While normally that would make no sense, there is a world-building reason why this is. And I'll pretty much just sum that up as magic, but for the setting, it is explained why that is. Then, how would the people and animals that live in these biomes interact? A desert, for example, you'll typically find they do have a large ecosystem, but they're populated mainly by tiny creatures. The people that live in a desert are likely to wear light and airy clothing, and their skin will naturally be darker to protect them from the sun. Compare this to a snowy mountain. The people there are going to dress in thick layers, and likewise, the animals will likely be covered in thick fur. Then there's the aesthetics. And while it seems minor, finding aesthetic inspirations is one of the most fun parts of world creation to me. Once again, and you'll probably be seeing a theme here, I'm going to say there are so many different cultures in the world, each with their own styles of dress and architecture that can make great inspiration for your world building project. Like I said earlier, the common ones we are used to seeing are East Asian, European, and Middle Eastern. But have you considered some different ones though? The different countries and cultures of Africa, for example, has a lot of really amazing and beautiful architecture styles that just aren't often seen in fantasy or even other genres. What about different punk genres? And no, I don't mean the hair spikes and the black leather. You've likely heard of steampunk and cyberpunk, but have you heard of the likes of solarpunk, which is based around the idea of an environmental and whimsical looking future? Or clockpunk, which is similar to steampunk, but focuses more on clockwork mechanisms, or maybe sandalpunk. which sees the technology of the ancient Greek and Roman worlds and then imagining it into a futuristic civilization. There is a lot of really cool punk genres you've probably never heard of. I suggest you Google them and take a read through. The aesthetics of a culture can tell you a lot about what that culture places importance on. Human architecture in Aurelia is heavily influenced by Art Nouveau, making use of its natural shapes and patterns. Being that the human religion in Aurelia is built around the idea of a sentient tree, the style of Art Nouveau just seemed really fitting for it. Meanwhile, the Fae have a more South Asian, particularly Thai aesthetic when it comes to clothing and architecture. You don't have to stick to established tropes when it comes to designing the aesthetics of a culture, and even mixing two wildly different ideas could be the recipe for something amazing. What if you made sci-fi style Vikings? Or take a usual trope and flip it? So my lovely people, those are my ideas and tips for when it comes to world building. Now if you liked this video, give it a like, comment, and maybe subscribe. I'm still new to YouTube, and anything you'd like to leave would really help me out. If you've got some cool world building ideas, feel free to share them down in the comments, because I love to hear about others' ideas too. Now if you're maybe feeling shy or nervous to share your ideas, go and check out my video in the time card above to see my advice on overcoming your anxiety to share your ideas with the world. Oh God, that scared me.